Muir.
Good morning. We're coming on the air because the Supreme Court has just handed down an historic ruling concerning Colorado's attempt to bar Donald Trump from the presidential ballot in that state. The decision coming just one day before Super Tuesday, when voters head to the polls in 15 states, of course, including Colorado. Just moments ago, in the case of Trump versus Anderson, the justices ruling in Donald Trump's favor, saying Colorado has no right to keep his name off the ballot this November. The state had argued he should be disqualified under the 14th Amendment's insurrection ban because of his actions leading up to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. But the Supreme Court just moments ago saying Donald Trump will remain on the ballot. Let's go to Terry Moran live at the Supreme Court. Terry, what have you been able to read so far?
Well, David, a rare moment of unanimity on a usually divided court. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court agree that states cannot kick candidates off the ballot under the 14th Amendment. That clause which you mentioned, which passed after the Civil War, held that people who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection are banned from holding federal office further. And what the Supreme Court said is that states can't enforce that it requires Congress to pass a law to outline how that clause should be enforced, concluding very simply that responsibility for enforcing that part of the Constitution rests with Congress and not with the states. The Supreme Court expressing real concern that states could go different ways. Some states would perhaps ban one candidate, some states perhaps ban another candidate. Other states keep them both on the ballot, and they express concern about the disruption that would work. They also said that the text of that constitutional article is clear and that it requires Congress to pass, quote, appropriate legislation in order to outline the enforcement procedure for someone who had done, as people have alleged, sworn an oath to the Constitution, then engaged in insurrection and run for office again. Nothing will happen. Trump will stay on the ballot in all 50 states.
And we should point out, Terry, that he is on the ballot. His name is printed for Super Tuesday tomorrow in Colorado, so voting will continue as planned.
That's right, because the Colorado Supreme Court, which originally held the opposite, that under the Constitution, Donald Trump would be banned from running for office, from appearing on the Colorado ballot, they said the Secretary of State should go ahead and prepare for both possibilities, pending Supreme Court opinion. Here we are the day before the Colorado primary. Supreme Court, once again, speaking with a unanimous voice here. Can't express how rare that is in a contested case. All the liberals joining with the conservatives in holding that Congress has the authority to keep people off the ballot under the 14th Amendment, not the states one by one.
Up to Congress, as you point out. Terry Moran leading off our special report here. Terry, thank you. We're wondering, Kate Shaw, our legal analyst. And Kate, as we heard Terry point out, they're unanimous in this decision, the justices on the court, and sending a very strong message that when it comes to a significant national issue of this sort, it should be Congress and not the states that decide here.
Well, David, the justices did all agree with that proposition. And interestingly, this opinion is a per curiam opinion, meaning there's no specific identified author. It's sort of a depersonalized opinion of the court. But I should mention there are a couple of concurring opinions. Justice Barrett writes separately to concur, and there's a joint separate concurrence by Justices Sotomayor and Kagan and Jackson, the 3 Democratic appointees, all suggesting that the court actually went further than needed in this case, essentially saying the only way to enforce this provision of the 14th Amendment is by Congress. But just as Terry said, the bottom line is unanimous that Colorado has to keep President Trump on the ballot, and so does every other state. So I think we're done with seeing state litigation around this question.
It was interesting, Kate, because we had a bit of a preview that this was coming, including the liberals on the court when they heard arguments in this. Elena Kagan had said, I think the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. This was at one point to a lawyer arguing against Trump's position. She went on to say, in other words, you know, this question of whether a former president is disqualified for insurrection to be president again, just say it, she said. It sounds awfully national to me. Strong suspicion that she would go this way along with the other liberal justices.
That's right, David. It was interesting that at oral argument, you did not see the ordinary ideological divides on display. Everyone on the court seemed quite concerned about what it would mean for a nationwide election in which we are choosing a national leader for everyone, for individual states to have so much control over something as important as whether a presidential candidate appears on the ballot. That's an argument about consequences. That's not really grappling with the history of this provision of the amendment or the intention of those who added it to the Constitution. That's really about consequences. But you saw that front of mind in the oral argument, and I think you see it on display in this opinion.
And bottom line, Kate, what does this mean for other states who have found similar findings as Colorado? As you know, a number of states have gone in this direction.
That's right. You had Colorado, Maine, Illinois. I think this opinion puts those to rest. At this point, none of those separate state decisions, whether by courts or by Secretary of State, as in Maine, to keep Trump off the ballot, can go into effect. So he will either be or remain on the ballot in every state. I don't think there's any way for a state to try to circumvent this ruling. At this point, any action has to be in the hands of Congress, and that's what the court said pretty clearly.
So it would appear this issue is off the table for good straight through the presidential election. Kate Shaw, thanks to you as well. I want to bring in Devin Dwyer, who also reports on the court for ABC News. And Devin, you're reading through the decision, a bit of a warning also, though, from some of the liberal justices.
That's right, and Kate just touched on that here, that the liberals were saying the court didn't need to go as far as it did. But take a step back for a second, David, on just how historic this decision is. Never before has the Supreme Court considered this part of the Constitution, so historic in that way. But not in more than 20 years has the Supreme Court directly weighed in on a presidential election months before voters are going to the polls. Obviously, going to the polls now in the primary, but the general election in November, this is a really big deal. And it's just the appetizer. The Supreme Court, in this opinion, which is unsigned, it's unanimous, they don't talk about Donald Trump's conduct. There's no specifics about what is alleged he is alleged to have done around the 2020 election. All of those questions are still to come next month, as you know, when the Supreme Court takes up another major case on his conduct.
Well, you bring that up, Devin, the fact that this was a bit of a setback for Jack Smith, the special counsel, in the federal elections case, the interference that involves January 6th. We learned that they will take up this issue of presidential immunity, obviously much different from what we're covering right here. But as you bring up, they will hear arguments. The earliest they could make a decision is May or June, and everyone at home in that case simply wants to know, is there a chance this goes to trial before the election? That window is very small.
A very small window for the Supreme Court to hear this case, this other case, give a decision, have a trial go forward before the presidential election in November. But, David, again, the underlying conduct in this decision today, that Donald Trump cannot be removed from the ballot for engaging in insurrection, is about to go back before the court. In this other case, the special counsel looking to prosecute Donald Trump for that very same conduct. And so these justices, again, are going to be asked to decide whether that trial can go forward, whether a president is immune, and it's really going to push this trial right up against the election when voters are going to be headed to the polls.
And of course, the point you're making here is that while they don't address the behavior in today's decision, they're going to have to. Certainly in the weeks ahead, we'll continue to follow that. Rachel Scott covers the campaign trail for us. Rachel, reaction already in from the former president?
Yeah, the former president just responded just minutes ago. He's calling this a big win for America. I'm also told that former President Donald Trump is expected to address this decision in just a matter of hours down in Florida at Mar-a-Lago. The Trump campaign was not only hoping that this decision would come down in this way, they were confident that it would happen. They called the Colorado State Supreme Court ruling flawed. They said they had the utmost confidence that the justices would ultimately rule in their favor. And of course, this all comes now just one day before Super Tuesday. We know that 800,000 voters in Colorado have already mailed in their ballots, Donald Trump's name on that ballot ahead of tomorrow, and the justices making sure that those votes are counted, and it stays that way, David.
All right, Rachel Scott with reaction from the former president, John Carl, our chief Washington correspondent right here in New York with me. And John, ironically, this amendment was made to reduce the power, not increase the power of the states here. And certainly what they've avoided here is a patchwork of states where Donald Trump is on the ballot or not on the ballot. That's just simply not going to happen.
It's fascinating to read this opinion. They make both of those points. One, they talk about how the 14th Amendment, of course, coming after the Civil War, was designed to keep the Confederates from coming back into power, envisioning a situation where Confederates would take over the state legislatures of the former Confederate states and use that power to try to sway, to try to sway the federal government. So this talks about how, no, this amendment was not designed to expand state power, designed to limit state power. So the idea that we would give the states, through the 14th Amendment, the power to choose who or who could not be on the ballot is simply doesn't make any sense. And they talked about the practical impact as well, saying you could see different states having different reasons for disqualifying candidates from the ballot and having a different threshold of proof. Some states may say if a candidate's been convicted of the crime of insurrection, they would be banned. Others saying just simply if the Secretary of State or election officials believed that to be the case. So they said you can't have that kind of a patchwork, and they use that word patchwork, different states having different reasons for banning somebody from the ballot. It would throw our entire system of electing a president up in the air.
John Carler, thanks to you as well. I want to go back to Terry Moran at the Supreme Court because, Terry, as we were talking about with Devin there, the Supreme Court is going to have to take up this issue of immunity in the separate federal interference case that involves January 6th. But without going too much further into that case, they did give a very strong indication in today's decision that they believe ultimately who should be president really should be decided at the ballot box.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. The whole panoply of cases brought against Donald Trump in all kinds of courts, not just the Supreme Court, but courts across the country, all have basically one aim: to stop him from getting back into the White House. And what the court says in this case is that the Constitution is clear that this route is not available. And across the country, there's a sense among voters that there's something not kosher about that, if you will, that they are pushing back against this and saying that the only way to decide who gets into the White House shouldn't rest in the courts or with prosecutors or juries. It should rest with voters in the ballot box.
Terry Moran live at the court for us this morning. Terry, thank you. And again, the breaking news coverage here live on ABC. As you know, Colorado's highest court had decided that Donald Trump should be kept off the ballot in that state, given what that court believed was his behavior leading up to January 6th. The Supreme Court, speaking loudly on this just moments ago, disagreeing with Colorado's highest court, saying that that state should not be able to keep Donald Trump off the ballot. Super Tuesday tomorrow, voters in Colorado will go to the polls. They will be able to vote for Donald Trump. His name is already on the ballot, by the way, but now they have cleared the way, the Supreme Court has, for Donald Trump to be on the ballot, not only in Colorado, but in every state in this country as we inch closer to the presidential election. Our coverage continues on ABC News Live, abcnews.com. Of course, I'll be back much later today with this entire team for World News Tonight. I'm David Muir in New York. Have a great day.
David, thank you. And I'm Diane Macedo with ABC News Live's continuing coverage of that breaking news in Washington. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled former President Trump is eligible to be on the ballot, and no state can remove him. Let's bring in ABC News legal contributor Kim Whaley, ABC News executive editorial producer John Santucci, ABC News political director Rick Klein, senior reporter Catherine Falders at Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate, and ABC's Jay O'Brien at a polling place in Arlington, Virginia. Kim, what do you make of this decision allowing Trump to stay on the ballot in Colorado and really all other states?
Well, it's not a surprise. I think it is a good thing that the opinion was issued per curiam, meaning there's not one justice that is taking responsibility for this. So they're trying to speak with a unified voice. But we do have two concurring opinions, one from Justice Barrett and then one from the three more progressive female justices on the court that took issue with the majority's decision to go even further and basically prescribe what Congress must do in order for this to be implemented. So the big one there is that, for example, if Jack Smith had actually indicted him for insurrection, a conviction on insurrection, the court is now holding that would not justify keeping him off the ballot. It only has to be through brand new legislation, through a very polarized Congress. So practically speaking, I think we can sort of close the door on Section 3 cases ever, because the hurdle to get brand new legislation through a Congress is so overwhelming. I don't think we'll see it anytime soon.
And I want to bring in senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer. Devin, not only was this opinion per curiam, it was a unanimous ruling here. How significant is that for this court?
Well, it's very significant, Diane. We don't see unanimous opinions from this 6-3 conservative court on this type of issue, certainly a political issue, high-stakes national issue very often. The majority of cases the Supreme Court hears are low-level administrative matters, technical, criminal law, procedural issues. Those draw unanimous opinions. But when it comes to something of this scale, we typically don't expect to see everybody on the same side. But it was a big win for the court as an institution to see them do just that. Obviously, the nation is very divided over this question of Donald Trump, his behavior after the 2020 election, whether he belongs on the ballot, whether this move by a number of states to remove him under the 14th Amendment is kosher. And so for all 9 of the justices to come together in this way and to say pretty clearly and simply, Diane, that that cannot be done, that states individually cannot disqualify him, is certainly good for the court as an institution, and I think for the country as we move forward into the campaign, that they said this with one voice.
And I want to go to ABC News Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw and to refine that point a little bit more, because Kate, this was a unanimous ruling, but we did also get some concurring opinions here. Some of the justices essentially saying, I agree with the bottom line, but I do think the court went further than it needed here. What did you make of that?
Those were interesting. I think, as Devin was saying, it is important that the court spoke with one voice on the bottom line question of whether Colorado could keep Trump off the ballot, and that it did so in a per curiam opinion without a single identified author. But it is important also to bear in mind these separate writings. So there was an opinion by the 3 Democratic appointees, Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, basically saying the court goes further than needed to resolve this case. It could say Colorado overstepped here and leave it at that, but instead it provided a lot of detail about exactly how Congress could disqualify someone if it wanted to, and the concurring justices disagreed with that. And then there was an interesting separate concurrence by Justice Barrett, seeming to respond to the Democratic appointee's concurrence. She basically said, we all agree here on the bottom line. Maybe we should be turning the temperature down rather than up in this fraught moment of a national presidential election. So there was some interesting crosstalk in the opinions. Nevertheless, the bottom line is the most important takeaway here.
Catherine, former President Trump is still facing multiple criminal cases while he campaigns for the White House. So how big of a role could the Supreme Court still play in this election cycle?
Well, look, it's clear that the former president is relying on the Supreme Court for decisions like this. Of course, in addition to this one on Colorado, what's still pending are arguments on presidential immunity. Essentially, Trump has claimed that he is immune from acts while president under presidential immunity. We know that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear arguments on that for the end of April. So the court really is poised here to make critical decisions that have potentially significant implications for the upcoming election. We know, of course, that also those arguments, the immunity arguments before the court, really creates this clock that's ticking as to whether this will even, the immunity case, the January 6th matter, as to whether it will even go to trial before the election, Diane.
And I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl. John, Trump had called this effort anti-democratic, saying the people should be making this decision. Is this a win for democracy?
I think so, and I think there's a really important line in this opinion. It's at the very end, and it addresses the kind of question, the challenge to our democracy, the crisis to our democracy, which is not only Donald Trump and Donald Trump's actions to overthrow the last election and to instill doubts about the next election. It's a question of our system of government being too hopelessly divided to function effectively. And if you get to the very last lines of this opinion, before you get to the concurrence, all 9 justices agree on the outcome of this case. That is the message Americans should take home. The court, it seems to me, is speaking not only making a judgment about the Colorado case and Colorado's arguments, and by extension, these arguments of other states that were trying to do something similar, but they're saying that this is a decision that can be judged based on what is written in the Constitution, based on our system of justice, a rule of law, something which is really under assault and in question right now.
Rick, this also lands us a day before Super Tuesday. So how could this decision affect Trump's campaign and Nikki Haley's, for that matter?
I think these 14th Amendment challenges have been a boom to President Trump because they underscored the point that he's been making, often without evidence, to say that there's a conspiracy against them or an effort to deny him the nomination. A lot of Democrats disagreed with these efforts because they didn't think they would succeed, and they thought they would just be kind of galvanizing moments for Republicans. As a practical matter, this really doesn't affect Colorado. Some 800,000 Colorado voters voted as of Friday already by mail. Most voters were voting anyway, regardless of this. And this makes the other challenges, including those in Maine and Illinois, go away. Maine votes tomorrow as well. So maybe at the margins that has some impact that minimizes what Haley can get out of it. And I think it also underscores or undermines a bit the Haley argument that Trump is damaged goods, that he can't win a general election. Now you have the court saying he can at least stay on the ballot. There weren't a lot of people politically that thought this was a smart strategy to defeat Donald Trump, either his Republican rivals or even, frankly, most of his Democratic rivals. This isn't something that Joe Biden or the Biden White House wanted to see proceed. This clears it up, and it clears it up in a very, very consequential and very strong way. But I think the most consequential work from the Supreme Court, as we've discussed this morning, is still to come.
Jay, given the historic nature of this decision and the timing of it, could it impact turnout tomorrow? People coming out to cast their ballots that maybe wouldn't have otherwise?
Well, it's unlikely to impact turnout necessarily, but what it does do is it plays into the Trump campaign's broader narrative that they've been laying out through this entire primary process going into the general election, which is that they say the former president is under attack. They point to his 4 pending criminal indictments, those ongoing civil cases, these efforts that the Supreme Court has now ruled on to remove him from the ballot. And so it plays into that larger narrative that the former president has been selling to his base of voters. The question that Nikki Haley is trying to ask the electorate is there enough moderate Republicans who are not buying that message that Trump is selling to at least give her a sizable percentage of Republican support so she can say to the Republican Party and to the electorate writ large, look at this chunk of moderate Republicans who under no circumstances want to support the former president. Last night when Nikki Haley won the District of Columbia and that Republican primary, it goes into that messaging when she got about 40% of the vote in South Carolina, despite losing to Trump by double digits. She said to voters, look at the 40% who backed me versus the 60% who backed Donald Trump. There are areas in some Super Tuesday states, like the one I'm standing in here, which is a suburb of the District of Columbia, where there are some moderate Republican voters that might break for Haley. But really, as Haley presents that question to voters, you also have to look at the numbers here, as Rick and everyone has been saying, which is Donald Trump is beating Nikki Haley by double digits in every single poll in every single Super Tuesday state. And so it looks like Donald Trump's primary to lose, obviously. And after tomorrow night, the Trump campaign is going to continue that messaging that they've really already been ramping up in recent days, which is that, in their view, this primary is over.
John Santucci, what are you hearing from Trump's inner circle about this ruling?
I mean, listen, they're ecstatic. I mean, they felt they're going to get a win after the Supreme Court's argument several weeks ago. They were all listening to it along with us in real time. They felt that the justices, obviously the conservative ones, would go their way. They felt they'd get some of the liberal justices, but the fact to get all 9, as one person just texted me, slam dunk. Now, that's now. The question is, how do you continue that momentum past Super Tuesday? Because obviously this is one court that's going to rule in his favor, but this month is going to be quite long because post Super Tuesday, we have trial 1 that's about to begin, which certainly is not going to go in Donald Trump's way. Look at what's happening in a courtroom right now in downtown Manhattan. His CFO is pleading guilty for lying to authorities there about that New York civil trial that he just got a $400+ million judgment against him. That still matters. That still weighs on Team Trump. They're certainly using the court activity to their benefit, but to think that we're going to be in a world soon where Donald Trump is going to be really off the campaign trail for several weeks, because this is different. Criminal versus civil. Criminal, he needs to be in Manhattan every day for those proceedings. So yeah, this was one court day that was a good thing for him, but soon that page is going to turn, and they're preparing for it.
You know, I'd say there's one aspect of this that's bad news for Donald Trump, and that is he can't raise money off this anymore. Yeah. I mean, this was the cleanest of all of them. I mean, he's been running as a victim. He's running as somebody who the deep state is out to get, and you know, he's a victim of a witch hunt and all of this. And this was the cleanest case. Look, they don't even want me on the ballot. They say, you know, that I'm a threat to democracy. They don't even want to let my people have the right to vote for me. So we can't say that anymore. Now you had a 9-0 decision. The liberals joining the conservatives. What deep state? So when the Supreme Court comes back on the immunity case, if they come back, and say, no, a president is not above the law. A president doesn't enjoy absolute immunity from virtually anything he or she would do in office. If the court comes out, I mean, what's he going to do, attack the Supreme Court as being hopelessly against him? No, the Supreme Court just showed that they judged in a case central to his campaign in a way that was above the ideological breakdown, above politics.
But when he loses that one, he's still going to fundraise.
Yeah, no,
okay, good.
still,
Just
yeah,
checking.
yeah,
Just checking.
yeah,
Just making
yeah.
sure. Okay.
So, Kate, talk to me about the history here and the precedent that this decision sets going forward.
Well, we haven't had any, contemporaneous or even recent interpretation of this provision. There were some cases just after it was added to the Constitution in 1868 that talked about what it meant. But this essentially lays to rest any idea that states could, of their own initiative, disqualify someone, even if there's a finding by a state court or other state actor that that individual engaged in insurrection, at least if we're talking about the president or other federal officials. The court does say that states have the power to disqualify individuals from the ballot for state offices. But the other thing that this opinion does is actually really constrain even how Congress could decide to implement this provision of the 14th Amendment. And that's sort of the source of the disagreement with the concurring justices. The majority, or the per curiam opinion, says that Congress has to pass legislation, but there had been some question, well, could Congress take a vote between an election and inauguration? It seems as though Congress doesn't have any power under Section 3 going forward during that period. All it can do is act by passing a law if it wants to disqualify someone.
All right. Kate Shaw, Jonathan Karl, John Santucci, Rick Klein, Catherine Falders, Kim Whaley, thank you all. We will be right back with more on this story and lots of other news today. Do stay with us now and throughout the day on ABC News Live. Again, you can always find us on various streaming services, the ABC News app, and of course on abcnews.com. The news never stops. We'll be right back.
Whenever news breaks,
We are here in Israel, a nation at war after that brutal surprise attack by Hamas.
On the ground in Ukraine, reporting from Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
ABC News Live is right there.